Chris Philp.
Well, thank you, Dame Cheryl, for that very carefully considered selection. It is I'm glad I was the least worst alternative. It is
Just to indicate that they wish to speak. They haven't yet stood, so Mr. Philp.
Well, I'm sorry that more attractive alternative didn't present itself, but it is, of course, an enormous pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I would like to add my congratulations to the honourable member for Harborough for securing this debate. Well, Dame Cheryl, I must confess, I'm not sure I ought to confess this in public, but I will. I must confess, when this document, Corporate Tax and the Digital Economy Position Paper Update, arrived in my inbox in March of this year, this month, I quivered with excitement because this is such an important topic, and I'm delighted to see the government, and in particular the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, who I gather has been upgraded to be the Paymaster General as well, to both. Well, there we are. He's a man of many talents. I was delighted to see the Financial Secretary taking the initiative in this very important area. It is worth saying that significant progress has been made in the last 8 years. Some colleagues have mentioned that already. The tax gap, of course, in this country, at just 6%, has gone down from the 8% it was in 2010, and it's the lowest amongst OECD countries, so that's a very good thing. And the amount of corporation tax we've collected has gone up from around about 35 billion to around about 55 billion in the last 8 years, despite the fact the rate at which the tax is levied, as my honourable friend the member for North East Hampshire has mentioned, has in fact gone down. So that is all extremely welcome, and the government is to be warmly commended for that progress. However, I think it is also true, and I think this is a view that commands widespread support, that a number of companies, typically large multinational companies, often providing digital services like Google and Facebook, have succeeded in organising their affairs fully in conformity with the current international tax laws, such that they are managing to argue that the substance of their economic activity takes place in very low tax jurisdictions, often in the Caribbean, which they have selected, I suspect, not for their clement climate. And that strikes me as fundamentally unfair and unreasonable. Now, the government has, of course, already taken a lead in this area via the base erosion and profit-shifting initiative, things like limiting the deductibility of interest expense to 30% of EBITDA is something that the UK government led on and is to be strongly congratulated for. But I think there is scope to go significantly further. It just doesn't seem right or fair that a company like Google, that has revenues in relation to UK customers in the order of £4 billion, pays virtually no tax by successfully arguing that the substance of their economic activity lies elsewhere. And that is why I was so excited, Dame Cheryl, by this position paper update published a few weeks ago. Now, the approach laid out in that excellent position paper, which, by the way, I fully support, to take a multilateral approach, trying to define or redefine on an international basis economic activity to account for the value created by users, I think is exactly the right thing to do. And I hope we're successful in doing that. But of course, as with any multilateral enterprise, it is going to take a certain amount of time, I expect, to get agreement with many other countries, particularly when some of these companies we're talking about will use their influence to try and slow things down and stymie progress. So while the multilateral approach to changing the way we define economic activity is certainly the right thing to do, I think it's also important we have a plan B that can be implemented much more quickly. And this paper does that admirably. It talks about a tax on sales, and as honourable members have said already, that is something the European Union are looking at. I fully support that approach. The sort of threshold we've talked about to exclude small and even medium-sized companies is the right thing to do. The number I heard mentioned, 3% of sales, seems like a reasonable number. I would simply make one point, and this is more for the 27 European countries rather than for us. I would take care to make sure that the European Union doesn't use this as a pretext for retaining those tax receipts itself, to sort of develop for the first time a European Union treasury function. That is not something which I think will concern us, but it may concern the other 27 members. Now, if the European Union don't move quickly enough in this area. If they don't implement this sales tax in a timely fashion, by timely I would hope the next sort of 12 to 24 months, I would advocate the UK taking unilateral action in this area. Now, my honourable friend, the member for North East Hampshire, raised a cautionary point about not making the UK uncompetitive. But, of course, this wouldn't be a tax based on where a company is domiciled. It would be a tax based on where its sales occur and where its users are. So it wouldn't be any disincentive to locating in the United Kingdom in terms of permanent establishment or in terms of locus of incorporation. So I think a sales tax, or indeed a user tax, which I'll come on to, wouldn't violate the principle of competitiveness, which the honourable member for North East Hampshire quite rightly referred to. We are, generally speaking, the second largest market in the world for these companies, behind the United States of America. And we're significantly larger than Germany because our economy tends to be rather more intensively digital. So I don't think, if we were to unilaterally take action in this area, I don't think you'd find Google or Facebook would suddenly say we refuse to do business in the United Kingdom, because if they did, they would be pulling out of their second largest global market. Now, in relation to unilateral action, while we're members of the European Union, and I would suspect also during the transition period, that is to say up to December 2020, I would suspect unilateral action on a sales tax would fall foul of European laws. It would probably get classed as VAT or sufficiently similar to VAT that it would fall foul of those regulations. So if we do have to consider unilateral action, which I would advocate and support, prior to our exit from the European Union or prior to the end of the transition period, something other than a sales tax would have to be considered. And I think one area that we might consider, which would not fall foul of European Union regulation around sales taxes and VATs, would be a tax based on users. You might, for example, set a user-based tax, a certain pound amount per active user, again, only applied to the very largest companies, perhaps with a UK turnover in excess of £100 million. And that would be a way of making sure they did make some reasonable contribution before we managed to come up with a multilateral solution, either at the global level or a sales tax at the European level. That would, I think, be a good move. It wouldn't undermine our competitiveness, and it would ensure these companies are seen to make a fair contribution. And I think the proceeds generated from such a tax could be usefully applied in the area of business rates, which a number of colleagues have referred to. I'm sure small businesses in our constituencies have all raised the issue of business rates with us. Of course, these digital companies like Google or Facebook, even Amazon, because they operate from very large warehouses in sort of remote locations that don't have a very high rateable value. All of these companies pay very little by way of business rates. We know they pay very little by way of corporation tax. They do, of course, pay payroll taxes. They pay their full share of payroll taxes, but they don't pay much by way of corporation tax or business rates. And it is rather inherently unfair that our local high street businesses do pay their full share of business rates and corporation taxes. So some of the money raised via this digital tax, in whatever form it takes, could be applied to offer business rate relief, particularly to smaller businesses, perhaps below £28,000 per year of rateable value. Dame Cheryl, I've laid out one or two ideas. I'd be interested to hear the Financial Secretary's response to those, but really I want to put on record my extremely strong and enthusiastic support for the course that the Financial Secretary has laid out here, and it's a great pleasure to come here and support it this afternoon. Yeah.